When people talk about the full run of Futurama, they tend to divide it into two categories: the original Fox seasons and the Comedy Central revival seasons, the first run and the second run, which is actually a fair assessment. Technically, production seasons 1 through 4 aired on Fox, while 5 through 7 aired on Comedy Central. However, production season 5 is sort of an outlier because while it did eventually air on Comedy Central, initially it went straight to DVD in the form of 4 movies. This is why personally I see Futurama as existing in 3 different eras, because these straight to DVD movies absolutely feel like their own thing and wedge themselves firmly in between the 2 broadcast runs of the show, bridging that gap. So today, let's dive into the seemingly forgotten era of Futurama and talk about Bender's Big Score, The Beast with a Billion Backs, Bender's Game, and Into the Wild Green Yonder. But first, let's talk about today's sponsor, Surfshark. Surfshark VPN is a super cool and helpful tool that can protect your information from data thieves and secure your online life. On top of that, Surfshark can help you unlock tons of content on streaming services like Netflix by logging in through a different country. So if you've run out of cartoons to watch on the US's Netflix library, no sweat, try out Australia or Japan. You can find shows like Rick and Morty, Archer, Close Enough, and more. One subscription gives you access to Surfshark on unlimited devices, so you can load it up on your PC, phone, tablet, Mac, you name it. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's plenty of time to make sure Surfshark is right for you. I've even got a special offer code for you that will get you 83% off and 3 extra months on top of that for free. Just go to the link in the description of this video and enter the promo code CHELLOS to get this awesome offer. Alright, back to the Futurama movies. I've talked about how Futurama was revived a ton on both my channel and my podcast, Cartoons That Curse, which, fun fact, is currently in the middle of covering these very Futurama movies, so make sure to go check those out on here on YouTube or any podcast platforms, if that floats your boat. But since this is a new video, I'll do a little abridged rundown of how the revival came to be. Futurama ended on Fox in 2003, but thanks to its syndication success on Adult Swim, as well as great DVD sales for the first 4 seasons, the show was granted a revival in the form of 4 straight-to-DVD movies, starting with Bender's Big Score in 2007. In one of the DVD commentaries for these movies, I can't remember exactly which one, David X. Cohen said that they had initially wanted to do only 2 movies, but pitched the studio 4 movies, expecting them to haggle down to the 2 that they actually wanted, but Fox ended up saying yes when they asked for 4. The way this season was written was actually quite a bit different than the series. A small team of writers assembled to brainstorm and break story ideas for the films, but eventually each screenplay was assigned to a different writer. Because of the longer production cycle and these movies not being part of an ongoing series, it doesn't appear that they benefited from having an ongoing writer's room for the duration of their production, a luxury of the original run. The season is really interesting to me. I actually have a ton of nostalgia for all 4 of these movies, and it's hard to describe how excited I was when they were announced, but they're definitely these outliers in the production because they were written and produced so differently than either the original run or revival seasons. Each movie was technically made up of 4 episodes apiece, and eventually each movie was trimmed down so that they could broadcast each movie as 4 separate episodes. So to anyone who saw them this way, this could just feel like a season with 4 serialized arcs rather than 4 movies. This is actually how they're currently listed on Hulu, each movie divided into 4 episodes each. I'm curious if any of you have only seen these movies in episodic form, so comment below if this was how you watched them for the first time and how that affected your opinion of season 5 overall. But also, there are extra jokes in the full movie version, so it might be worth going to watch those if you haven't seen them. The small writers' room gathered to brainstorm in 2005, and on November 27th, 2007, the first Futurama movie, Bender's Big Score, was released on DVD. And I gotta say, I will defend Bender's Big Score until the day I die. This movie stands as one of my favorite Futurama stories. It is seriously something special. In fact, I've talked about it a lot already in these videos and also this podcast episode, so if this video doesn't fully scratch that itch, feel free to check those out. Bender's Big Score did everything I hoped it would do. It brought back the series on a much grander scale, gave us emotional character-based storytelling, and an incredible time travel sci-fi plot with twists and turns aplenty. Honestly, I feel like I could have gone to see Bender's Big Score on the big screen and been completely satisfied with it as a cinematic experience. And that shouldn't be too big of a surprise. It was written by Ken Keeler, who has written some of the best episodes in all of Futurama, including every single series finale they ever did. Even though these were written sort of as a 4-episode mini arc, Bender's Big Score feels really cohesive overall, and most importantly, the character work is excellent. This is something I talk about at length in another video, but the Fry and Leela focused story is truly something special in Bender's Big Score. Score. Leela falls for a guy named Lars in a whirlwind romance, which obviously upsets Fry, but through the time travel shenanigans, we eventually learn that Lars is in fact a time paradox duplicate of Fry, who lived out a separate life back in the 2000s. Lars is basically a Fry who has grown and emotionally matured, which is obviously very attractive to Leela. She's said this before.
Fry is very sweet, but he's so immature. I love his boyish charm, but I hate his childishness.
And while watching the film the first time makes you sort of hate Lars because he's interfering with the Fry and Leela romance, on rewatch, knowing who he is, it makes all of these sequences really endearing.
I don't know who I am anymore.
I know who you are. You're the woman I've been waiting for all my life.
My favorite is actually this date montage. It's really lovely and you can feel their romance and connection growing, even though it hurts Fry in the process. But the coolest part about the Lars-Leela storyline is that Lars actually propels our version of Fry's growth forward faster than he might have grown otherwise. Lars' experience in the 2000s actually taught him the selflessness he needed. He learned that letting Leela go was actually the best thing for her, and that if he truly cared about her, that her happiness needed to come first.
You too. It's enough to know you're happy with Lars.
This was, of course, before he realized that he himself was the very Lars he was jealous of.
I'm Lars? I'm Lars!
But Lars' romance with Leela actually propels Fry forward in that same exact way, and Fry shows that same selflessness in the face of his own heartbreak. It's a really cool way to tell this story because ultimately we actually spend much more time with Lars in Bender's Big Score than we do with our Fry. But through Lars' journey, we understand and see that important growth in Fry. And at the end of the movie, we get this lovely little button with Fry and Leela.
He was a good man, Leela.
Yeah, you were.
Now, as much as I adore Bender's Big Score, that isn't to say I thought it was perfect. I did think that the nude scammer villains left a little bit to be desired. They had some really funny sequences, but the story itself felt bigger and more grand than its villains. It also brings in the Nibelonians for about 1 minute before they're knocked out of the picture for the remainder of the film.
Our kitten-class attack ships were no match for their mighty chairs.
But it also used other side characters really effectively. The Harlem Globetrotters are hilarious as always, and Robot Santa makes a couple very funny appearances, including a hysterical song with the Hanukkah Zombie and Kwanzaa Bot. And while I did find the subplot with Hermes' severed head to be pretty entertaining, LaBarbra's lack of support for Hermes felt like a stark contrast to the relationship we'd seen from them in the original run, though I do understand that the writers really wanted to include Barbados Slim. And to top everything off, the film ended on a pretty wild cliffhanger, with the time paradox duplicates of Bender creating a massive tear in the universe. Nibbler even eats himself to escape. And this giant tear in the universe would play a massive role in the second straight-to-DVD movie, The Beast with a Billion Backs, which would release on June 24th, 2008, about 7 months after Bender's Big Score. At the time, The Beast with a Billion Backs was not nearly as well received as Bender's Big Score. The screenplay was written by Eric Kaplan, and while it did focus on the giant rip in the universe caused in Bender's Big Score, it definitely doesn't feel like a sequel to that film, which personally I think is a good thing. I have to admit, when I saw The Beast with a Billion Backs for the first time, I did not love it. And initially, this was my least favorite of all 4 of these Futurama movies. However, the more time I've spent watching these movies, the more this one has grown on me. While I still think much of this story leaves a lot to be desired, I also think that it is a very funny movie. There are some seriously classic Futurama jokes and moments throughout it, including one so legendary that I laugh every single time I think about it.
I knew you'd come back!
Here you go.
But unlike Bender's Big Score, this is where you can really start to see the seams of the story a bit more clearly. The transitions between each of the 4 episodes of the movie are a little more clear. They immediately introduce a new love interest for Fry, Colleen, who admittedly is a very funny character, driven by an excellent Brittany Murphy performance. Rest in peace to a legend. This story is basically all about jealousy. Fry enters a polyamorous relationship with Colleen, who is dating and lives with a handful of other men already, and while he thinks he can look past this, he decides he can't handle this kind of relationship. But by the end of the movie, Fry is spearheading the biggest polyamorous relationship in history, as he's basically the spokesperson for the interdimensional being Yivo, who lives on the other side of the giant hole in the universe. Fry basically recruits the remainder of society into the cult of Yivo, who then all attempt to date Schler simultaneously. Eventually, the entire universe decides to move in with Yivo, mirroring Fry's decision with Colleen at the beginning of the film. But since only organic matter can pass through the tear in the universe, Bender and all the other robots are left behind, which basically leads to Bender's jealousy story story that his friend Fry has left him for someone new. There's also a subplot where Amy sleeps with Zap after Kif is killed in an assault on Yivo, which leads to further jealousy from Kif after he's revived. Even the Professor and Wernstrom's rivalry contains a ton of professional jealousy as they fight over who can or should solve the issues at hand. So yeah, thematically, this film is all about jealousy and relationships, which I can definitely appreciate in broad strokes. They did a good job making sure that every subplot of the story had ties to this overall theme, and I think that really helps the movie overall. However, while the themes all tie, the plot still feels a bit disjointed, at least compared to the previous film. The second episode in particular feels very disconnected from everything else, introducing the League of Robots into Bender's story, but sort of moving away from the Colleen stuff, and relegating the giant tear in the universe to the background for a bit. In fact, it almost felt to me like the League of Robots could have or should have been its own episode of Futurama, like maybe it was an idea they had in the original run that they shoehorned into this movie, though I can't say that for sure. But in the end, I still have a lot of fondness for The Beast with a Billion Backs. It's incredibly funny, has some great performances, and does some really interesting work with its theming across all of its subplots. Plus, it has one final voiceover performance from Brittany Murphy, and she's really great in the role.
I've got good wine, 5 sweethearts, and today I was promoted to Chief of Police.
There are also some really awesomely conceived and directed sequences animation-wise. The Nimbus flying around and attacking the tentacles is really cool. I always love this duel scene between Bender and Calculon. It's super creative, and I low-key love the sequence where everyone starts to leave the universe to head to Yivo, like a mass ascension to heaven. Really great stuff. Interestingly though, they chose not to leave off any sort of cliffhanger that sets up the following film, Bender's Game, like they did between the first 2 films, which personally I didn't love. I think they should have either gone all in on connecting the 4 movies or not at all, though I don't really have any pitch on how they could have connected the second and third movies, but they should have done it. And speaking of, let's talk about the third film, Bender's Game, which released on November 4th, 2008. This film was written a bit differently than the others, as it has 5 credited writers who all tackled different episodes of the story. Parts 1 and 2 were written by Eric Horsted, Part 3 was written by Michael Rowe and Eric Kaplan, and Part 4 was penned by David X. Cohen and Patrick Verone, though it is worth noting that the story credit goes to both Eric Horsted and David X. Cohen. But I think these writing credits are pretty important for Bender's Game because this is the Futurama movie that absolutely does not feel like a movie. So these different writers tackling all the different parts of the story makes a lot of sense after watching it. Parts 1 and 2 of Bender's Game feel sort of related, but very much operate as separate episodes. Parts 3 and 4 definitely feel more connected to each other, but completely disconnected from the first 2 parts. The main through line of this story is Bender's overactive imagination causing him to roleplay as a fantasy character named Titanius Anglesmith. Part 1 details his descent into madness and complete detachment from reality, which admittedly can be very funny at times. Part 2 completes that descent to madness by showing Bender institutionalized in the same robot insane asylum we saw back in the original run in the episode Insane in the Mainframe. I also have to admit that I really like a lot of this stuff. Insane in the Mainframe is a great episode, and seeing a lot of these characters again was really fun.
I was designed by a team of engineers attempting to build an insane robot. But it seems they failed!
But running simultaneous to this Bender stuff are some tough to follow stories about Mom, Farnsworth, and the existence of dark matter as fuel in the universe, plus some weird Leela anger stuff complete with shock therapy. They attempt to tie all of these stories together for parts 3 and 4, but I honestly still don't even fully understand how it works. They basically use this dark matter sci-fi story to facilitate the creation of this fantasy world through Bender's imagination. So parts 3 and 4 of Bender's Game are a full-on fantasy world parody. But personally, these last 2 parts don't work for me at all. They really feel like nothing more than a parody of better fantasy stories, whereas Futurama was always best making its sci-fi premises feel unique to its own world building, even if they were inspired by other sci-fi material. It's especially noticeable after watching 3 seasons of Disenchantment, which does a significantly better job building out its own world and lore in a fantasy setting, rather than feeling like a comedy knockoff of existing worlds. It is always jarring to me when this movie switches between the sci-fi world and the fantasy world. I appreciate that they tried to tie the stories together and explain it through the sci-fi, but it never quite works for me. I think the first 2 parts of Bender's Game have enough going on comedically to keep me pretty engaged, but I just simply am not a fan of the fantasy episodes. More than any of these 4 movies, this one feels like a series of loosely connected episodes instead of one cohesive story. I also have to say that I have a ton of frustrations about a certain reveal in this episode. We learn that Mom's son Ignor is actually Professor Farnsworth's son as well, which I think makes a ton of sense given the context of the series, but they absolutely never bring the storyline up again in the remainder remainder of the show, which seems like a major missed opportunity. They also reintroduced Nibbler in the episode without ever explaining how he returned after eating himself at the end of Bender's Big Score, and they also very clumsily explain why they're not surprised he can talk.
Hey, wait. Aren't you amazed I can speak?
Well, actually, no. You forgot to blank our memories after you spoke last time.
Okay, but if Nibbler had been wiping your memories, then how did you know he ever wiped your memory? This is a dumb piece of dialogue and only makes sense to the audience and wouldn't make sense to the characters. So yeah, overall, not a huge fan of Bender's Game. I think some of it works and is funny, but the success of the episodes rests on the fantasy parody, which I think doesn't work particularly well. It does have interesting ramifications for the Futurama world at large. The result of this film is that dark matter no longer functions as a fuel source, so the remainder of the series, the ships use whale oil instead, which is pretty funny. Also, I laugh at this line every single time.
Huh. So that's why they call me the Catman.
And that brings us to the final Futurama film, Into the Wild Green Yonder, once again written by Ken Keeler. This is a really interesting one because it was written as though it could have been a series finale, something that they had to do 4 times over the course of Futurama. And while I do think this movie does a lot of great work in the finale department, as a story, it feels a bit overstuffed. They go to great lengths to make this one have a larger scale, but personally it still doesn't feel as grand as Bender's Big Score, which is a bit of a bummer. This movie also ties a few long-standing threads from Futurama's original run into the story, finally revealing who this dude with the number 9 shirt is, a background character who they allegedly had plans for throughout the entire series, as well as bringing us the finale of the Free Waterfall saga. If you didn't know, the Waterfall family is a family of activists first introduced in The Problem with Poplars. Every time a member of the family is featured in an episode, they die at the end, sort of a weird little underlying story arc. The movie does start with an incredible opening sequence with a song sung by Seth MacFarlane, and I have to say, this song gets stuck in my head regularly. I really appreciated the entire intro, and it's cool that Seth came in to sing this song for him.
You and I will be reborn in a future place and time.
But again, the movie really does feel overstuffed. The first story is all about Fry getting in an accident that gives him mind-reading abilities while Bender has an affair with the Donbot's wife. The two of them both enter a poker tournament, which, saying all of it out loud, makes it feel really disconnected from the overall plot. The real through line of the film are Fry's mind-reading and introduction to the Legion of Madfellows, and Leela joining the eco-feminist collective that protests across the solar system. And I think what works best about this movie overall is how it ties Fry and Leela's stories together. As it turns out, Fry's mission from the Legion of Madfellows and Leela's mission in her eco-feminist collective are one and the same, to save the Violet Dwarf Star from being destroyed. However, because of an ancient evil known as the Dark One, which can read thoughts, nobody except for Fry can have a plan to stop the Dark One from destroying the star, since his lack of a delta brainwave makes it impossible for his thoughts to be read, so the plan can't be learned by the Dark One. Every time I explain this plot point in a video, it sounds so convoluted, I'm kind of tired of talking about it, but I do think it works well with Fry and Leela's story. Early on in the movie, Leela and some protesters are accidentally responsible for the death of Vice President Agnew, and so she goes on the run from the law. She tries to explain herself to Fry, but Fry doesn't actually need her to explain.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
This is a really sweet moment that shows how much Fry believes in Leela and how much he knows and understands her as a person. But at the end of the movie, Leela is struggling to afford Fry the same belief, as it appears as though Fry is working to destroy the Violet Dwarf Star and cannot tell her his true plan because of the Dark One. Fortunately, Leela eventually comes to her senses.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
I truly love these moments in the story and think that it's a really nice way to put Fry and Leela's relationship and bond at the forefront of the story, even in a movie where they're separated nearly the entire time. This final sequence also features pretty much every single character that has ever been in Futurama, which is nice for a send-off, and they even wrap up the waterfall story in a pretty massive way, which is fun for longtime fans of the show. And while it does feel a little tacked on, when the crew eventually escapes and is chased down by Zapp Brannigan, it leads to some really nice finale moments before what could have been the end of the series. Fry and Leela kiss, and the crew pushes forward into a wormhole, not knowing what their fate will be.
Into the breach, meatbags. Or not. Yeah, whatever.
Go, go, go!
I've always liked this final little stretch and think it would have been a solid ending had the show never returned, which of course it did. So yeah, there's a lot to like in Into the Wild Green Yonder, but I definitely think it's much less cohesive as a movie than the others, especially thematically, except for Bender's Game, of course. It feels like they could have done more to tie Fry and Leela's stuff into the story sooner, and some of the plot points in Leela's activist story start to feel really spread thin. They get caught, tried, arrested, sent to prison, and broken out all in a matter of like 10 minutes. I think one of the biggest problems this movie is that it has this underlying theme of women being disrespected and treated unfairly by men and by society, while the script itself sort of also disrespects the female characters. It ends up reading like the writers and script are covering their protesting talking points in a sarcastic tone. Sometimes it feels like they're making commentary, but other times it feels like they're just reinforcing these same issues. But overall, Into the Wild Green Yonder does a lot of stuff right and sends Futurama off in a pretty satisfying way. So let's talk about this era of Futurama overall. Was it a success or was it a failure? Where does it stand in the history of the series? Well, personally, I think it was a mostly successful endeavor, even if they had some stumbles and missteps along the way. I'll forever appreciate that these movies exist and tried to tell Futurama stories in a new way. It was a fun experiment, and I think that if they had more time, they might have been able to perfect this style of storytelling for Futurama. Bender's Big Score will forever stand as one of my favorite Futurama stories, and while I don't love Bender's Game, there is plenty that I enjoy and appreciate about The Beast with a Billion Backs and Into the Wild Green Yonder. I think if I could change anything about this movie season, it would have been to somehow shift these stories so that Bender's Big Score was the final film. That's the movie that felt the biggest and had the biggest ramifications for the character stories that we have been following for years in the original run. While I enjoy the Fry and Leela stuff that worked in Into the Wild Green Yonder, I don't think it worked as well as it did in Bender's Big Score. Plus, the time travel aspect of BBS actually works really well for a final film, feeding the audience some pretty great fan service with all of the connections to Fry's past and older episodes. It would have felt like these stories had been escalating to the biggest and most character-focused story, but that would have required a lot of rewrites and reworking, and overall, I'm still happy with how it went down, mostly. I think this era of Futurama actually probably goes underappreciated. They delivered some really fun stuff in a brand new format, something that is not easy to do. And while I'm glad that the series eventually came back and graced us with traditional TV episodes again, I'll always appreciate the risks that were taken and ambitious stories that were told in this weird little movie season. But how do y'all feel about the Futurama straight-to-DVD movies? Do you think they worked? Are they among some of your favorite Futurama episodes or least favorite? Let me know below in the comments. Also, make sure to check out my podcast, Cartoons That Curse. I mentioned this earlier, but we're in the middle of covering these very movies right now, so if you want to hear me and Toonerific Tariq plus some special guests talk about these movies, check those out. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.
Johnny!